we look at other developments in the late 30s which held promise for the future. A small number of black American performers, mainly singers, came to Australia in the 30s. The Davidson Band broadcast with the Mills Brothers during their 1939 tour. The Mills Brothers were given a tumultuous welcome at the Melbourne Swing Club. The Tivoli brought out Nina Mae McKinney and her two accompanists, York D'Souza and Kirby Walker, in October 1937. Others who toured Australia at this time included Chris Gill, who had sung with Ellington, Chuck Richards, who had sung with the Mills Blue Rhythm Band, Chick Webb and Fletcher Henderson, and Ada Brown, who sang in Fats Waller's last film, Stormy Weather. One night in February 1939 at the Trocadero, Frank Coghlan spotted Gene Rogers and invited him to sit in with the band. Rogers had played with Clarence Williams and King Oliver, among others, and was performing at the Tivoli with Frank Radcliffe. This record features some musicians who had been with Davidson's band. Dudley Cantrell and his Grace Grenadiers on a fine version of the Will Hudson song Harlem Heat, recorded on 22nd November 1937. When Davidson went back to the Sydney Palais Royal in 1936, the ABC was left without a Melbourne dance band. They experimented by importing a conductor to lead a band specially formed for him. After considering every big-time leader in England, they chose Howard Jacobs and his arranger, Cecil Norman. Jacobs was from Boston, Massachusetts in the USA, but had been in England since 1922, conducting in places like Claridge's, the Berkeley and the Savoy hotels. Al Hammett, assisted by Abe Walters from Perth, selected the 16 musicians for Jacobs from Sydney and Melbourne. From June to October 1936, Howard Jacobs' ABC Dance Orchestra toured all states of Australia, appearing at town halls and theatres, and picking up about 6 extra string players in each state. The tour was so successful that Jacobs' original contract was extended for 6 weeks, and at the end of his stay, the ABC announced that they would form 2 permanent dance bands, one in Sydney, Davidson's, and one in Melbourne. Hammett took over the band after Jacobs left. On trumpet was George Dobson.
And then in about 1937, I think it was May 1937, Dutchie and I received this cable from Charles Moses, now Sir Charles Moses, top boy of the ABC, asking us would we be interested in joining the National Dance Orchestra at the ABC in Melbourne. That appealed to us very, very much, so we said yes. And we went back to Melbourne. I was married at that particular time, and Dutchie was just about to get married. And we went back to Melbourne, and the conductor was Al Hammond, and the saxophones were Jack Moore, Tom Davison, Charlie Crowley, Cecil Mitchell, and the brass myself, Albert Simons, John Robertson, Dutchie Turner, Gordon Critcher. On the bass was Norm Goldie. On the piano was Charlie Fields. Harry Bloom was on the guitar. Harry Bennett on the drums. Dennis Collinson, Alan Saunders violins. Vocals, Jeff Brooke, Peggy Brooks, and the Rhythm Boys.
Overseas band leaders were tried by other organisations in Australia. The Palais Royal in Sydney tried a Hollywood leader for 6 months in 1935. Sonny Brooks and his arranger, Maury Paul, liked sweet Guy Lombardo-style music but their season wasn't a success and they returned to America. The Trocadero employed a Canadian, Bob Lyons, for 4 months during an absence by Coghlan. Lyons brought out many arrangements in the style of Artie Shaw and Woody Herman, and his arranger was Rupert Dumbrill, who had arranged for the Americanadians when that band attempted a less than successful tour of Australia in 1937. Colin Bergerson was in Lyons' band at the Troc.
Anyhow, there's Bob Lyon, to Rhapsody in Blue, and we all had blue suits and white shoes. He was on Glenn Miller kick, and also Woodchopper's Wool, Woody Herman stuff and all that sort of stuff. We did a lot of that sort of thing.
This is Jungle Drums by the Artie Shaw Orchestra, recorded 19 December 1938. An interesting experiment with imported band leaders occurred at the Palais de Danse in Kilda, where the band was conducted first by an American, Jay Whidden, then by an Englishman, Roy Fox, and then by Whidden again. Jay Whidden was a tall, fine-looking man who had been to Australia before, in vaudeville in 1925, with a laughing violin act at the Tivoli.
That takes us up to January about 1938. And we are back now at the Ginger Jar, but this time the Ginger Jar has changed the name to Smith's Oriental, Sydney. Theo Walker's personality band, so-called. Theo on saxophone, myself on trumpet, Dutchie on trombone, Bernie Duggan on the piano, and our old mate George Watson on the drums. This is October 38. From Sydney, Theo got the job, organised by Jay Whidden, to pick up certain musicians in Sydney and Melbourne. This necessitated a trip to Melbourne by Theo to tee up the jobs for the boys, meet Jay Whidden, and organise this band, which turned out to be a very, very fine band. Jay Whidden was very, very popular. Jay Whidden, conductor of the band. This was at the Palais de Danse, Melbourne, which also included playing the overture and stage presentation at the Palais Pictures prior to the fact that we went into the dance hall at about 8:30. Before that, we were started about 7:45, play the overtures in the pit under Harry Jacobs conducting.
That was next door to me.
Yeah, next door. And then at about 8:30 we would go and play at the Palais, which was a fairly hard job. Every night, Thursday and Friday were late nights, 2 o'clock nights. Sometimes Wednesday, Thursday and Friday would all be till 2 o'clock, and Saturday was the 12 o'clock public night. Jay Whidden was the conductor, Theo Walters associate conductor. Brass, George Dobson, Frank Arnold, Dutchie Turner, Charlie Thompson. Saxophone, Bobby Gibson, Sid French, Bill McCarthy, Reg Lloyd. Bernie Duggan on the piano. Max Jordan on the bass, Todd Foster on the guitar, George Watson drums. Vocals by Sylvia Sefton and Mavis Curtin and Vic Moore and Lawrence Brooks. A few changes during this engagement. Lou O'Leary came in on guitar. Doris Casher, Lou's wife, took over the vocals when Sylvia Sefton returned to USA. Alan Redding came in on tenor saxophone. Wally Norman came in on trumpet and trombone. Monty Richardson made a second piano. The various changes came about when Roy Fox replaced Whidden in February 1939.
What were the differences between the two styles?
Jay Whidden was a very handsome, well-dressed man. Stood up, played the violin occasionally. He was the American type. Relaxed, very relaxed. That was his big forte, I think, relaxation. Plus the fact that he had a very good arranger working for him in America, one of the top arrangers who used to send over some terrific arrangements, real American style big band arrangements. They were really wonderful arrangements. And plus the fact that we don't want to minimise our own boys, Bobby Gibson at that time was doing some fine arranging, and Dutchy Turner was doing some fine arranging, and I also contributed in that department. But Whidden was the relaxed type of a man, American style band music, big band music, very good band. In those days it were called Sweet Swing. When Foxy came in, a marvellous man, a very popular man with the musicians, Foxy, but a very suave, sophisticated English type hotel conductor.
Yeah.
I don't think he was quite as successful as Whidden, but he was a wonderful man, really a great guy.
As Dobson said, Jay Whidden developed Bob Gibson's skills as an arranger.
He had his idea of a style. He used to always say, oh, this is the style I want. Very tall, very fine-looking chap. He used to play violin, and he was what you'd call the society band over in America, you know. And he's a very pleasant man and with a ton of personality.
And he had his own arrangements, did he?
He had a lot of them, but then he used to encourage. I used to do a lot. I started to do a lot of arrangements for him.
And when you were arranging, did you try and make it a less commercial sound, more jazz-oriented?
Yes, more that way, more easy phrasing and swingy and so on like that. But I suppose it's almost like a forerunner of the old Artie Shaw things with easy phrasing and sort of stuff, you know. Not when I say easy phrasing, the sort of swingy phrasing and relaxed phrasing. Jay got away right from the other style of music we played before, and it was very refreshing. It was a style. He used to use a lot of cup mute stuff and a lot of colour. He liked colour. He liked solos put in, and he liked, instead of all ensemble, he liked a lot of solos put in. Well, that was that, and then of course by this time the bands that were coming out of America then were starting to really pile out the great arrangements like Tommy Dorsey, and then of course Artie Shaw, then Glenn Miller, of course, superseded everything in those days, and everybody went Glenn Miller mad. Well, they still are to a certain degree, but it was a style that really captured everything. It swept. I would say everything, and it was influenced. It influenced every band, I should say, in the whole world, the Glenn Miller style. And except, of course, the competitive bands in America. I don't say it influenced them. Ellington was still Ellington. Dorsey was still Dorsey, and so on. Shaw was still Shaw, and the other bands, Basie was still Basie. They didn't try to copy that. They still retained their own styles. But I mean, I'm speaking more or less of the commercial bands outside, you know. Yeah. It certainly influenced my writing.
Yeah.
And it influenced a lot of arrangers. It had to. Even Frank Coughlin would agree with me that it influenced their style. You know?
When Roy Fox came, he was an Englishman, did that?
Yeah.
Did he bring a change of style?
Yes, different change of style. It was a very stilted style, back to a very stiff thing. Everything was rush. Everything was very straight and stilted. It was just a different style. And then after playing with Jay Whidden, we'd sort of relaxed. And then when Roy came in, Roy, a lovely man, a lovely fella, but he brought all these arrangements, and they were so different. They were so far different. The writing was different, the voicing was different, the whole concept of the arrangement was different. And
did it go over just as well with the dancing public?
Not nearly as well, no. No,
So-
but then Roy was there for one season, I think, and then he left and went back to America, and then went back to England. Then after that, Jay came back, and then he was very unhappy because it took quite a while to get the style back to what he wanted it to see. But we did, and by that time was 1939, and things were starting to happen, and that's up until the time I left.
This is the Glenn Miller Orchestra recorded on 1st August 1939 playing I Want to Be Happy. (1938 and 39 were the transition years out of the strict tempo era, though the grip of the dancing schools was not finally broken until rock and roll came along. The transition was assisted by growing numbers of jitterbugs, young swing fans who wanted to do more than the staid ballroom steps. In Melbourne, the jitterbugs loved the Sunday afternoon jam sessions at the Faulkner Park kiosk, run as a dance from early 1937 by two champion ballroom dancers, Mickey Powell and Bill Panter. Bob Tuff led the regular band there, which included Ben Featherston on drums, trumpet and trombone. Bob Tuff's style and harmonic sense were attributable in part to his association with Featherston, for whom he had played the previous year when Featherston was leading the band at the 40 Club. Featherston was a major figure at the kiosk, as Billy Weston remembers.
I want to mention another guy about those early days in Melbourne that did have a profound influence on me. That was the Faulkner Park Jazz Kiosk, where I played. There was a man called Ben Featherston, who was a drummer, but who played things on trombone that any trombonist, any time up to today, would be proud to say I played. He was another guy that turned me on to trombone. He and Frank, I'd say, were the two that turned me on. And also had like Charles Lees and Sid and others, a big influence on my private life as well. Ben was a monster, and we had the same background, the college boy crap and that sort of family and all that business. We had a lot in common. And Ben was wonderful. He also played bloody good trumpet. Cornet. He used to play a cornet. He was one of the few that did those trumpet cornets that Bobby Hackett plays, you know. He was one of the few people in the country that he had one of them and used to play that. But he was basically a drummer, and a hell of a drummer. He's like Buddy Rich, he couldn't read. A tremendous sense of anticipation of what was coming next in a new arrangement, things like that, which Buddy's got. And he had a big influence, you know, the way he played trombone made me want to play a trombone like that. There's a saxophone player that mustn't be forgotten, that's Bob Tuff. If you talked about him, he was quite an influence on me. He came into the Bob Gibson band. He wasn't in the original band. He was living in Sydney, but he came down to Melbourne, came into the band. And he was, I see a sort of a chain. He was the first, I'm going to put it this way, the first real tenor saxophone player I ever heard in Australia that didn't play it like a euphonium, that didn't play variations on a theme. He played jazz, and he had a tone, something like I was used to hearing on records of Coleman and Lester and people like this in the late 30s. And a good, highly developed harmonic sense with Charles Lees and people like that hung out together up here in Sydney. And he had a profound influence on making me think a little bit about what I was doing and things like this. And I sort of see it come down the line from Tuff. And at the time, you know, Crow was a hell of a player.
Charlie Blott was a young drummer starting to find his way in jazz in Melbourne.
I don't know if any of the other guys have mentioned the Faulkner Park Swing Club. I just managed to catch the end of that just before it was taken over by I think it was taken over by the Americans at the Red Cross Centre. something.
Trinity Wharf. How was that run, that Faulkner Park?
Well, it was run as a dance on Sunday afternoons, and they used to have all the local guys that, Benny Featherston was one I remember well. First time I saw Ben was down there, although I didn't realise we'd been neighbours for 2 streets. We lived actually 2 streets away all that time.
Yeah.
And, the local lolly shop used to be brother and sister, the son of the proprietors, Frank Newman and his sister June, and Frank used to play drums and have his band a bit, and I remember seeing this photo of Duke Ellington up in the shop one day. I think I just started buying the first Tempo magazines, that were nearly downbeats and what have you. And I asked about that, that's Duke Ellington, isn't it? And she said yes. And, got talking, and she said, haven't you been to the Faulkner Park Swing Club? And I said no. And she said, oh, well, you meet me outside. I was only kidding. She said, meet me outside and I'll get you in. Apparently she used to go regularly there every Sunday afternoon. And I went in there, heard this band, Benny Featherston. I think some of them had already been called up then, the nucleus. I believe Bob Tuff was the original tenor player in the band, great tenor player. His brother Ernie on bass, Alfie Warren on piano, Bob White on drums, who also lived near me. He was a very fine drummer. He went into his father's real estate business and gave it all away. Anyway, that was quite impressive hearing all those guys, and unfortunately that was just about the last, I think it was the very last Sunday, which I believe the whole thing had been running for many, many years, originally starting, I think, around about 1934 in the Palms, in the gardens, Alexandra Gardens, and then later they went to the Faulkner Park kiosk. But that was the Melbourne Swing Club, I think they called it. That was the venue for hearing any hot music in those days.
Yeah.
Larry Keane, Neville Madison, I remember, in the band. That was the first time I saw him.
Was supposed to perform there too, wasn't
He could have. A lot of them used to come and sit in, yes. As I say, I was
wasn't
only...
it sort of just a pickup band for the...
No, they had their regular house band, and as I say, I only just heard the very last before the thing broke up, so...
Yeah. And these guys were playing jazz or swing?
Yeah, that's swingers they do it in those days. Yes, Benny Featherston used to play a very wild high trumpet, as I can remember. Nev Madison and Larry King were very good cooking up riffs all the time. I remember that. I used to be quite impressed with the riffs they used to cook up. That was the place all the musicians who were interested in jazz used to go there and jam,
Ben Featherston was like that too, I understand.
Yep.
Oh, Ben was a wonderfully natural musician, whatever he turned to. I used to go around to Ben's when I got to know him, every Sunday. And he had a fabulous collection of records. Sunday, just before lunch, I'd come around there. Ben had come out clutching his head and moaning, and I being a bit naive, I didn't drink or anything. I used to say, oh, you're a bit crook, Ben, eh? I'll go home if you like. No, I'll be right in a minute, be right. And he said, let's play some bloody records. He was very fond of the Red Nichols, Five Pennies, the band, particularly the bands that had Teagarden and Fudd Livingston, Goodman and Krupa and Stanley King, this drummer. Benny often said that he was the one that, Stan King was the one that influenced his style of drumming most. And who I think was a very underrated drummer. He seemed to have disappeared off the scene about in the early 30s. He did play with the Goodman, one of the very first Goodman bands before Krupa. He was a very fine drummer. And Ben, I always thought, looking back now, did model his style on that particular drummer.
Graham Bell, who, with his brother Roger, was soon to become a pivotal figure in the emergence of Australian traditional jazz.
Have you heard of Benny Featherston? He had a band that used to play at the swing club. It was called the Melbourne Swing Club, and they used to hold meetings. Some of the meetings were at the Faulkner Park kiosk on a Sunday, and we used to just sit down on the floor. Times haven't changed much. We used to sit down on the floor very starry-eyed and look at Frank Colgan and Benny Featherston and these fellas playing, absolutely spellbound with our mouths open, and they were gods to us.
That was Someday Sweetheart by Eddie Condon's Chicagoans, recorded 11 August 1939. Eddie Condon's Chicagoans was an influential band on Australian traditional jazzmen.
Colin Kean Cohen was secretary of a thing called the Melbourne Swing Club, and people like Benny Featherston and Frank Coggan, and a pianist by the name of Mr. Love Ellington. Oh, I can't think of his name now. We may have met Bill Miller through that. Anyway, it was somehow through jazz. But the very early stages, I think Roger and I were just getting into trying to play then.
Yeah.
So we used to have nights at Bill Miller's home, cakes and ale, as he called them, and jazz. And we'd hear these 78s of his because he had things like Bessie Smith and Ellington and Big Spiderbeck that we didn't have.
You mentioned that there were many professional musicians around who could play jazz, like Coghlan and Featherston and that. So, from a historical point of view, why do you think it was that it was your band which really made the name for jazz, at that time?
Yeah, I think I can answer that. I would say that those musicians that you mentioned were a little bit analogous to the session man of today, who plays jazz for relaxation, but really makes his money out of doing studio and session work. So the Frank Coggins and those people really made their money out of ballroom dance music, but they were also capable of playing jazz.
Yeah.
Now, in our case, we weren't the slightest bit interested in playing ballroom music at all. Unless we could play jazz, we weren't going to play at all, because we earned our livings at that time at different other professions, whereas these people were musicians. So they had to make their living at whatever they could. If they couldn't play jazz, it had to be ballroom dancing or palm court stuff in the Australia Hotel. I can imagine Quartet C, playing with including people who were capable of playing jazz. But we didn't have to do it, and we only got interested in jazz as a form of free expression. I found that most of us were either very interested in classical music or mildly interested in classical music, and saw jazz as something free from this, without tossing over the love of classical music.
Another group which caught the attention of Graham and Roger Bell and their circle of friends was Muggsy Spanier and his Ragtimers, here playing Riverboat Shuffle, recorded on 22 November 1939. Australian jazz progressed a lot between the Depression and World War II. The good bands pulled themselves out of the ricky-ticky style, and there were now soloists whose playing could only be described as hot. Leading arrangers assisted the soloists and voiced bands in more interesting ways. Dance musicians gained a sense of identity, particularly through the magazine Music Maker. Newspapers still gave a lot of space to people who wanted jazz to go away, but they were coming across to the idea that jazz could be discussed seriously. In the 30s, a chair in a leading palais band remained the top job in the dance profession. But there were regular places where a musician could jam and experiment with jazz. The general public was still content with ballroom dancing, but enthusiasts helped to loosen the straitjacket of strict tempo music through their swing clubs and jitterbugging. Records, while still not freely available, were there if you searched for them, and the general awareness of who was the best to listen to had increased markedly. This is a March 1940 recording of Dick Freeman's Trocadero Band playing Bluebirds in the Moonlight, arranged by pianist Reg Lewis, husband of Barbara James, who's on vocals.
There are bluebirds in the moonlight, silly idea, bluebirds in the moonlight, but that's how I feel when I'm with you. There are night owls in the daylight, silly idea, night owls in the daylight, or maybe my heart is saying, ooh, 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 who is the one for me? You, that's what you've done for me. There are bluebirds in the moonlight, silly idea, bluebirds in the moonlight, but that's how I feel when I'm with you.
In spite of the upheaval, the Second World War proved to be a stimulus for Australian jazz musicians. Over 1 million Americans passed through Australia during the conflict, including Artie Shaw's naval band. In the band was Max Kaminsky, here playing Jar Dar with Roger Bell's jazz gang on 19 September 1943. Surveying the early years of jazz and dance music in Australia, it is clear that developments in the music in the USA, but also in the United Kingdom, were the major influences. Gaining the ability to play jazz was a slow process, but as time went on, more and more Australian musicians were thinking for themselves and finding a public who would let them do so, which gave Australian jazz the beginnings of its own independent momentum. If you want to find out more about Australian jazz in general, you can read my book, Black Roots, White Flowers, with additional chapters by Bruce Johnson. Bruce Johnson, apart from his position as a senior lecturer in English at the University of New South Wales, is a jazz musician and a perceptive writer, so you'll find that his new book, The Oxford Companion to Australian Jazz, published by Oxford University Press, is rewarding. At the beginning of this series, we heard from individual Australians who'd first heard of jazz serving their country overseas in the First World War. We conclude the series with a band that was about to enlist and carry their own music into war, the Jim Davidson Orchestra, here in November 1939, playing We're Going to Hang Out the Washing on the Siegfried Line.
Now, Mum, don't worry if it ain't too clean. I'll need to break your back. We're off to France so you can stick that singlet in me pack.
We're gonna hang out the washing